My job is to pretty much focus on the legal issues. And there's a whole lot of healthcare, psychological, emotional issues that I'm not trained to tap into. And that's why your work is so important, because you are the ones who are being trained to identify those issues so that you can go out and serve people who are hurting, not just in a legal sense, but in the full holistic sense of the word. So, steps in the process at the U.S. border. There's two main ways that immigrants arrive at our southern borders. One way is by what we call arriving legally. By arriving legally, that means you present yourself at a port of entry. Anyone here been to Tijuana? Or ever had to go through the border? That's a port of entry. You present yourself at a checkpoint, you present your documentation, you talk to an immigration officer, either Customs and Border Patrol, someone like that. Used to be just plain Customs back in the day. They check your papers, they allow you to come through. That's the way you enter the country legally. The other way that people enter the country that's entering with permission. You can also enter without permission, which is when people very often don't know that there's such a thing as a port of entry, and they think the only way they know how to get here is with the help of a guide, a guia, a coyote. Has anyone here ever heard of Harriet Tubman? It's something like that type of a guide, but Harriet Tubman was operating out of altruistic humanitarian purposes. The guides that are helping people, the guias, the coyotes, they're operating for financial gain. So it's a whole different level of journey that they're making. But either way, so whether you arrive at the border through a port of entry or through crossing the river or the desert, something will happen. You'll probably have an encounter with an immigration officer. If you're at the port of entry, for example, San Isidro, you'll be detained, you'll present yourself and say, I'm asking for permission to come in so that I can apply for generally asylum, or I have some problem, I need to be allowed to come in, I know I don't have the right documents to come in. That's what the caravans that you're hearing about on the news now, that's what they're trying to do. They're just trying to find a way to come and present themselves at the border legally and say, may I come in so that I can apply for asylum. If they are admitted in a little bit, 1 foot inside the door, then they are initially questioned by Customs and Border Patrol or ICE officers about who are you, where are you from, are you a citizen of the United States, what country are you a citizen of, and if the person says I'm here because I'm afraid to go back to my country, they can ask to have an interview with an asylum officer. If it's their first time crossing the border, they'll have what's called a credible fear interview. If they've been at the border before and were deported maybe and came back because my life is still in danger, I still can't stay here, they may have a reasonable fear interview. Either way, it's a basic screening to see if your fear of persecution is credible. If the asylum officer determines that your fear of persecution is critical, and by the way, asylum is not just something that the United States offers because we feel like being nice to people. And asylum is an international matter. Asylum exists in many, many countries, and it's a process that's very, very old. The United States, as a matter of official policy, got on board with it later than other countries did. So it's something that's international. It's an international form of relief for people who are afraid to go back to their countries and for humanitarian reasons should not be forced to return. So you'll have your interview with the asylum officer. If they determine that your fear of persecution is reasonable, you may have the opportunity to be released. Is that better? Okay. There's 2 different ways you can be released, because even if you came to the border the right way, you're going to be detained one way or the other. You can be released on your own recognizance, which means that the immigration officials at the border have determined that you can be released into the United States to someone inside the United States without having to post bond. Or they'll say, no, you have to post bond, and either ICE will make that, or ICE or immigration officials will make that determination, or sometimes they get referred to an immigration judge, and you go to what is called a bond hearing. And there the judge will determine what's the amount of bond that should be set based on whether you're considered a flight risk, whether you pose a risk of danger to people in the United States. And even though you have a credible fear and you have the right, they're going to give the opportunity, not the right, the opportunity to present your testimony for asylum before an immigration judge. So again, you'll either be released on your own recognizance or you'll be released on bond. If you're released on bond, then you get to come into the United States, you get to the place where you're supposed to go, and then you wait for news of when is your first immigration court hearing. If you were not released on bond, you didn't have to pay bond, they released you on your own recognizance, your own word that you're going to show up for your hearings, then there are two steps that come up. ICE and ISAP. ISAP is the Intensive Supervisory Appearance Program, and basically saying we need to be sure you're not going to run off and become a flight risk. So what are we going to do to you? Anybody know? Ankle monitor? El griete? So you go and check in here in the Bay Area, you would go and check in with the ISAP offices in San Francisco, and they will check in your paperwork and they will put an electronic GPS ankle monitor on you. These days it might be for about 3 or 4 months until they're pretty sure that you're reporting, you're complying, you're not going to pose a flight risk, you're not going to evade any of the American processes, and then on presentation of the right type of ID and documentation, they'll take it off. That's one. The other thing that you'll have to do is report to ICE. So it's like a check-in. However often they tell you to check in. You check in and they confirm, are you still here in the area? Is your address still the same? And then they'll give you another date to come and report. You still haven't got to the level of the immigration court yet. Now you get a notice in the mail saying, here's the date for you to have your first hearing in immigration court. And this is the beginning of the process where the judge will ultimately decide whether or not you can remain in the United States. Along the way, when you're detained, actually, just to go back a little bit, before you are released from detention, ICE officers will issue what's called a notice to appear or a notice of referral to immigration court. It's similar to criminal proceedings because it's the charging document. And for the cases we see, the accusations pretty much go like this. 1, you're not a citizen of the United States. 2, you were born in Nicaragua and you're a citizen of Nicaragua. 3, you entered in the United States more or less around September 1st, 2017, around Hidalgo, Texas. Number 4, at that moment, you didn't have any permission to enter the United States after being inspected by an immigration officer. Then you get down to the rest of the body of the accusations. Based on the above accusations, it is charged that you could be removed, deported from the United States because you were in violation of the following section of law. Section 212A6A1 of the Immigration and Nationalities Act as amended because you are an immigrant in the United States who entered without inspection, without permission, or you are present in the United States at whatever place or time other than those places and times that have been designated by the Attorney General. And therefore, you are ordered to report to an immigration judge so that they can determine whether or not you should be deported from the United States. It's pretty similar to that. Men who are coming to the southern borders do a little better if they're fathers and have a child with them. They'll be more likely to be placed in a family detention environment. There's a better chance that they may be released on bond or on their own recognizance. Men who present themselves or are caught trying to cross the border, who are alone, have a tougher time of it. They'll be more likely to be placed in detention for a long time. If they're able to present their case for asylum, they're going to have to present their case to a judge while they are detained. And when you are detained proceedings, it's a tougher case with the judge. So again, if it's a man with children, it's kind of better to split the kids up, and dad will come with one person, mom will come with the other kids, and then the family has a much better chance of being able to make it through so that they can present their cases for asylum together and hopefully stay together. Other things that happen while you're detained is you have different levels of pressure and intimidation and manipulation from immigration officers. Very often we hear stories of, we've heard some of women being beaten by immigration officers because they were just irritated at them. Immigration officers yelling and shouting at people. Immigration officers telling people, just sign this, just sign it. And if you don't speak English, actually, if you do speak English, if we gave you a copy of a legal document and they said sign it, what's the first thing you ought to say? Can I read it first? No, just sign it. Just sign it right there. Just sign it. Just sign it. And then they'll ask, they may ask certain questions that they're required by law to ask. Sometimes they don't ask those questions, but they mark the form saying that, oh, well, I asked him if she was afraid to go back to her country, and she said no. And when you talk to the client later on, they'll say, he never asked me any of that. Or, well, he didn't speak Spanish. Or, he was going so fast and he was threatening me, I was afraid I didn't know what to say. So the process is not always evenly balanced. These days with the current administration, some of the ICE officers are more aggressive. We ran into one last week in San Francisco that was absolutely amazingly aggressive, trying to manipulate a situation because he thought the particular immigrant who was entitled to apply for relief before the judge. He was trying to kind of persuade this person and yell and scream at this person that you should have brought your wife, you should have brought your wife. Well, the wife had no reason to be there. There was no warrant for her detainment. There was no warrant for her to present herself before ICE. So why was he so adamant that the wife present herself? You tell me. What do you think was going to happen? I leave that to your imagination. So that's really a very quick overview of the initial process when people arrive at the border. Do you have a right, and I do want to say this very quickly, what do you think? Do you think that when people arrive at our borders asking to be able to be allowed to apply for asylum, is that legal or is that illegal? Is it okay for you to say I'd like to apply for asylum? What do you think? Who thinks, don't be afraid, you won't tell. Who thinks it's okay? Who thinks, I don't know if it's okay, maybe you shouldn't come at all, because that's not what you're hearing from the administration. You're hearing people are coming here as invaders, but actually by our own laws, that's the way you are supposed to come to the United States if you don't have any other way to enter legally. To come to a port of entry and say to an officer at the border, I would like to be able to come and talk to an asylum officer. I'm afraid to go back to my country. If I go back, my husband's going to kill me. My boyfriend's going to kill me. The barrio 18, they're going to kill me. Whoever it is. That's the legal way to do it. So if you hear people say, to refer to asylum seekers as invaders or criminals, it's kind of twisting the message, and you need to do your own homework and read up on that for yourselves, because if I go too much farther, they're going to talk about me all week long in the office. Okay. I want to just talk a little bit about unaccompanied minors, because you're hearing a lot these days about family separation. There's two different categories. There's unaccompanied minors, and they're separated minors. Unaccompanied minors are kids who are under 18, who don't have legal status in the United States, and they're present at the border without a parent or guardian. Are there a lot of them? Oh, yes. And they're traveling alone or in groups, but they're not at the border. They get detained at the border without their parents and without their guardians. Once immigration officials determine, oh, this person that we just arrested, they're a minor and they classify as an unaccompanied minor, they're supposed to be turned over to an Office of Refugee Resettlement shelter within 72 hours of detention. Why? Because they're kids, and you're not supposed to be keeping kids locked up like that. You should turn them over to a shelter. Does that always happen? So those are unaccompanied minors, and they'll still be placed in removal or deportation proceedings, but they're supposed to be treated a little bit differently because they're kids. Separated minors, on the other hand, are the ones that we've been hearing more about on TV and radio these past few months, because they are the ones who are victims of family separation. They came to the border with their parents, and they were separated from their parents anyway. That's a whole different thing. At this point, based on the statistics that I got last night as an update, in terms of unaccompanied or separated minors, there's over 13,300 migrant children being detained somewhere near the border, or they could be transferred anywhere in the United States, anywhere there's a shelter bed available. Over 13,000 being detained as of September 2018. Sometimes families and guardians are too afraid to come forward and contact or follow up with the shelter social worker because they're afraid that they will now be arrested and charged with human trafficking. So if there was a bad situation going on in Honduras and the family there decides that we've got to get this child out of here, if she stays here, the MS-13 is going to rape her because she doesn't want to be the gang member's girlfriend. And that happens all the time. It's a very real situation that happens. Or you have a young boy, and this is one of the clients that we had, that says, I can't stay here anymore because the gangs are going to kill me because they think I'm gay. Or I am gay, and they can tell that I'm gay. And they've already assaulted me once. I can't stay here anymore. It's not acceptable for me to be gay in this particular country. Let's just say Guatemala. If I stay, they're going to kill me. So you have the child they come to the border, they get detained at the border. The family here didn't know they were on their way. But you've got an uncle up here in Vallejo. So the social worker gets a call from the uncle. The uncle gets a call from the social worker. We have your nephew here at the border. He's in detention as in a shelter for unaccompanied minors. Do you want to have him released to you? Used to be the uncle would say, well, sure, and you go through all the paperwork and background checks, and your nephew is released to you, and then he still has to go to immigration court, and there's that whole part of the process. These days, family members and potential guardians are a little bit more concerned about saying, yes, this child can be released to me, I'll be the child sponsor. Because what the current administration is acting on the presumption that if you agree to be the child sponsor, you must be responsible for having brought this child here illegally, which means you are now guilty of what? Human trafficking. And some people, well, many times the sponsors themselves are undocumented. And it's okay for a sponsor to be undocumented. It's not a problem being released from a shelter to someone undocumented. The problem is, are you yourself going to be accused later on of wrongdoing just because you want to help a child or a family member? So the situation is becoming a little bit more tenuous now. I understand 41 people who were potential sponsors have already been arrested and charged with trafficking. All they're trying to do is help a child get out of detention. And as it is detention, they call it shelters, that's the official word. But there's a lot of abuse and mistreatment, and also for the healthcare professionals here, sometimes forced drugs. Sometimes forced drugging of kids, just to keep them calm and compliant, because God forbid they should be traumatized and acting out because of their trauma. Okay, just very quickly, what you saw about access to counsel from the YouTube clip. It's not always as easy as it sounds to be able to get an attorney. You may not be able to have access to a phone. It's not an easy process. And if you do have access to something, how do you know that your attorney is an honest attorney and not a crook? There are a lot of nonprofit agencies that do a fantastic job of serving people who are detained, adults as well as kids, as well as families, both at the border and inside the border, but they can't cover it all. Their phones are ringing off the hook. They just can't do everything. They can't serve everybody. There's been a new legal victory in California for attorneys, bless you, to be able to reach and contact their detained clients. I think it's kind of interesting that an attorney actually had to file a lawsuit against the government to be able to talk to their own client who was detained. These are things that I think as healthcare professionals, what does that say about the level of stress that a person has to endure? I'm trying to reach my attorney. I can't reach my attorney. My attorney is trying to call me. They won't let my attorney talk to me. I know one colleague who actually had an ICE officer tell him, you don't need to talk to them. And she calls saying, I need to talk to my client. Oh, you don't need to talk to him. And the warning signs, getting off of healthcare professionals a little bit, is if that type of abuse of due process is allowed to go unchecked at the border, because people are thinking, oh, well, these are just illegal aliens. They don't matter anyway. They shouldn't be here. How long do you think it would be before those type of illegal, unconstitutional encroachments on due process, bit by bit, tap the rest of us one by one, especially if you are a person of color? You start off with something that's easy and no one's going to make a big fuss. And the next thing you know, well, we were able to do it here, so we can do it here. Okay. The last thing I wanted to talk about, because I really am watching the clock, is what's going on with family separation, just so you have some basic facts. Attorney General Jeff Sessions has enacted a zero-tolerance prosecution policy. It's not so much because we as Americans or green card holders or whatever, not so much because we're in danger. It's basically designed to discourage people from trying to come here. That's basically what it is. There is a settlement agreement that relates to children. It was a legal agreement reached a couple of decades ago, where after a class action lawsuit, the government agreed if we are detaining a child, we're not going to hold a child more than XYZ hours in XYZ place. This is why you're coming into problems and conflicts with the family separation policies, because what happens if you have an adult mom with her 2 children and you want to detain mom for a longer period of time? Oh, but she's got the kids with her. So, well, gee, what are we going to do about the kids? Well, by law, we can't detain the kids for more than XYZ number of hours, but she's got the kids with her, so gee, what are we going to do? Well, separate them. That'll do it. That takes care of it. So that way we're not violating any regulations about treating children, because we're going to take them and put them someplace else, and we can keep mom in detention a lot longer. And that's part of how this whole policy of family separation came into play. The Department of Homeland Security says at this point, only 522 children who were detained under the Zero Tolerance Initiative have been reunited with parents. Only 522. There are some parents at the border who signed forms in English, which they could not read or understand, but they were signing forms under duress, saying, I will waive my right to apply for asylum. Just please give me my child back. And then there's the issue of, well, where's the child? Because people get moved around so much, you don't know where the child is. And then there was something new that we heard about, was it a month or two ago, Melinda, where they were saying, oh, well, you know, we have these kids over here in the room, and you're saying that that one's yours, but, well, how do we know that that's your child? How do we know that you're not a human trafficker? So that kind of gnarls the process up even more. So yeah, it's a bad situation at the border. It is so bad that the Department of Homeland Security, which is over all this, and they are under Jeff Sessions, by the way, the Office of Inspector General for the Department of Homeland Security itself, just early October, just last month, issued a scathing report about what was going on with family separation at the border. They found that the Department of Homeland Security at the border, you're talking about your own people, that they were not fully prepared to implement the zero tolerance policy. They weren't prepared to deal with some certain effects of the policy, and that was putting it nicely. They weren't prepared to deal with the situation of hundreds of parents deported back to possible harm without their children. They weren't prepared to deal with hundreds of migrant children who still remain alone in government custody. And they were not prepared to deal with the extensive and permanent psychological trauma to children and parents. Now, one more thing. The Office of Inspector General also confirmed that the administration was lying back in June 2018, when Homeland Security Officer Kirstjen Nielsen declared, we do not have a policy separating families at the border, period. There was also, and those of you who are healthcare professionals will understand this, the depths of this way better than I can. They were not prepared to deal with Border Patrol, was not prepared to handle nonverbal children. I think that will resonate even deeper with you guys in this classroom. They were not prepared to handle the situation of babies and toddlers, and you will know this better than I can. What's the psychological effect? What's the traumatic effect when a baby, a toddler who is not able to articulate, is separated from a parent? And Customs and Border Patrol was not prepared to deal with that. This report also highlighted the scenario that's being presented by asylum seekers who are arriving at the southern border, trying to apply for asylum the right way by going for a port of entry, and there's now litigation being brought on behalf of those who have been denied access to asylum through what's called the metering process, which basically means you have immigration officers at the border who are telling asylum seekers, oh, well, there's too many of you. We can't see you all. Come back tomorrow. And they're leaving people outside in the scorching heat, no food, no water, no bathroom facilities. You have women, children, infants, breastfeeding mothers, and they're just, oh, stay outside till we have time. We can only talk to X amount per day, and we don't have time to talk to all of you. So, and that's how you're kind of metering out. It's another way of trying to discourage people. But when you are facing a situation that is so horrific and so deadly at home that you would risk your life to make a 3,000-mile journey, that you would risk your physical safety to ride that train, a freight train, not Amtrak, not the Coast Starlight, but to ride a freight train called La Bestia through Mexico, and you're riding on the top of the boxcars, and you have to try your best to stay awake, because if you fall off, if you get drowsy and fall off the train, as some of you know about La Bestia, you fall off the train, you can get crushed to death, you can be crushed by the train wheels passing over, or you could be harmed by someone else on the train whose intentions aren't as good as yours. And then you go through all that trauma to arrive at the border and be told, no, or to arrive and to be told, oh no, we think you're a criminal, you're a rapist, you're a drug dealer, you're an invader, you're other. And no matter what your position is personally, no matter what your beliefs are personally on the political implications of immigration, as health care professionals, I believe everyone in this room is called to care for the well-being of the individual first, as a matter of humanitarian policy rather than political policy. So with that, I am going to stop and open up and see if we have any questions. And thank you for your time. I went over, Melinda. Don't say anything tomorrow.
Are there any questions? Yes. Pass this down.
So I was wondering what resources are available while the immigrants are detained in terms of access to health care?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad a healthcare professional is asking that question, because I think you are the ones who need to advocate just as hard or even harder than the attorneys do, because you know what's at stake. Access to healthcare is minimal, just like it is in any other type of jail or prison. A lot of people are not getting the care that they need. People who maybe have blood pressure, HIV, AIDS, cancer, diabetes, are they getting the treatment that they need? Not necessarily, but that's the same issue as you have for just anybody, mainstream Americans who are finding themselves in detention, like the cases where pregnant women in detention are being shackled as they're going through labor and delivery. You know, the state of healthcare and the detention systems in this country is generally pretty deplorable. And I think that happens, but this is just my opinion. This is not legal fact, because very often people tend to think if you're in jail, if you're in detention, if you're in prison, you must have done something to deserve being there, and you don't deserve to be treated any better. So it's not too good. And the situation is even further exacerbated if the prison is being run by a private for-profit, because then they have a financial interest in maximizing profits, minimizing expenses, and healthcare expenses are expensive. So.
Ma'am, do you have any approximate data with respect to the numbers of illegal immigrants coming to the U.S. over the last decade? And I think I had heard numbers as high as 30 million undocumented people living in the U.S. before 2008. But we've had a big recession since then. Opportunity in Latin America has improved, while here it really probably hasn't. So I'm just curious, the flow of people across the border.
I had something that I printed last night. Did everyone hear the question, by the way? I had something last night, and I didn't print it out because I thought, I won't have enough time. And sure enough, now I wish I had. The statistics that I've seen, and you do have to search for reliable sources of information. The statistics that I saw last night were showing that actually the numbers were slowing down, as opposed to what you're hearing from the White House. The numbers of people coming, there are probably several million undocumented folks living in the United States right now. Some of them might not even know they're undocumented. If you were brought here at 2 or 3 years old, as far as you know, you're an American. So that's just, are you aware you're undocumented? But that would be in the aggregate. It wasn't like 30 million people across the border undocumented just in the past 2-3 years. The numbers are no way, they're not that high. The numbers are, from what I remember seeing, kind of leveling off a little bit. And if you look at the Department of Homeland Security website or ICE and look at their statistics, how many people are they detaining at the borders now as compared to last year, 2016, 2015, I don't think the numbers were really increasing. It's just getting more media attention, especially with the caravan, because people are coming in a large group of numbers. But as far as the economic situation, I can speak to what I just saw today about El Salvador with the problem with the gangs there. And you know how the gang problem in El Salvador really began in the United States, right, in South Central LA, and then kind of went down, so it's like an American export. So, but there, the problem with gang-based corruption and extortion and control of cities is getting to the point where I think one particular gang was made over $600,000 in, I forget the period of time, just from extortion and controlling neighborhoods. And it was at the point where, like, let's just say the MS-13. If the MS-13 controls your neighborhood and they don't know you, you may not be able to get in that neighborhood without putting your life at risk, because they want to know who goes in, they want to know who comes out. And you have to get permission. Sometimes you have to buy your way in. Even what I read in this report last night from a credible source, even government officials, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, even government officials now coming into a new neighborhood have to get clearance through the gangs. So yeah, there's money being made. And if the economy is increasing and getting better in El Salvador, a good part of it could be due to gang extortion, because they're making goo gobs of money. So I don't think I could honestly say the economic situation for the average Salvadoran is increasing, because if things were getting better, people wouldn't need to leave. If there were jobs, people wouldn't need to leave. Most people that we talk to, I think Melinda will bear this out, if they're saying, yeah, I need to work, my mother's there, she's sick, my grandmother's sick, I need to send money home to help my family. And when we ask people to talk about what their homes were like, especially I'm thinking Guatemala or in Honduras, you ask people to talk about, tell me what your life was like at home, and they begin to paint these beautiful pictures of being out in the country where it's lush and green and beautiful, and you're like, wow, I'm from Brooklyn. I've never seen anything like what you're describing. And the things that people know how to do, why would you want to leave that? And then you ask them, would you have left if you didn't really have, well, why did you leave all that? And you see this sad, wistful look flicker across their faces, and they say, I couldn't stay there anymore. It wasn't safe. Either it wasn't safe or there was simply no work and I had no way to feed my children. No way. So in terms of the economy getting better, I would like to hope so. I think we'd like to be able to retire early, but all I can say is as you go back and check your sources, make sure you're getting it from an objective, neutral source, because there's people skewing data on both sides of the issue. Yeah, I think there was one more question.
There was one more quick question, and then we have to wrap up.
You cited an example of a father with child at the border as a circumstance that was advantageous to that father in seeking asylum. Are there any similar kind of circumstantial maneuvers or, I guess, hacks, for lack of a better term, for people who are currently undergoing deportation proceedings here, much after the fact, not at the border, like how they can set themselves up to be more successful against the state and not getting deported like that?
No, I think I understand what you're saying, but it's a slightly different issue. When I'm talking about the issue of a male at the border asking for permission to even just to talk to an asylum officer, just to have a chance to apply for asylum within the United States, from the scenarios that we've seen, if a male with a father presented himself at the border with a child, there was a much better chance that he would be able, even though they were going to be detained, that they'd be detained at a family detention center and then get some kind of permission to be released and to come into the United States, not to wreak havoc, but just in the interest of family unity, if you will, so that the father could come in with the child and be able to apply for asylum before an immigration judge in a non-detained category, as opposed to, and we've seen them both ways, depending on how the family came here, where there's a group where the dad came by himself and mom came with all the kids. And you could have both families equally eligible for asylum, but dad got detained, was held in detention, had to try his case in detention before a detained judge, which is a much tougher sell, and got everything denied, and wound up being deported, where his wife and kids were allowed to come in. Why? It's the same circumstances, the same risk of all. Why? Because this adult came with children, and the other one did not. So things like that can make a difference. Not always, but noticeably enough, it does make a difference. All right. And with that, thank you all for your time and attention.